Today, it seems like we're in a time of extremes, especially political extremes, and censorship of people who don't agree with us, or censorship. I'm going to make a plea for moderation, not just about politics, but for everything from the amount of love you show to your loved ones, to cooking, to personal appearance, to meditation, to everything. I want to say, though, that all of these examples of where moderation may be wise are probably general truths, at least in my opinion, but we're all individuals, and we may choose to be moderate about some things and extreme about others, and I think those personal choices and predispositions obviously need to trump those, but hopefully my discussion of all of these individual examples may help you at least more consciously decide whether you want to be more moderate about any of them. I'll just list them up front so you'll see what we're going to be covering in this edition of How to Do Life, in this YouTube video. By the way, this is a podcast. I'm making these audios on YouTube, which then get converted into a podcast so you can listen to it, not just have to watch me here. I'm not so good looking. Anyway, I'm going to be talking about, first of all, some examples of where extremism is okay. Then I'm going to talk about where moderation is wise even in love, to your romantic partner, your family and friends. I'm going to talk about how social to be versus solitude, the amount of talking versus listening, question asking, joking, amount of celebration. I'll give you a pretty funny example in a few minutes. How much should you display your abilities? Again, these are all about, I'm going to be pleading for moderation here, and most people will, in theory, agree, but in reality, not be so moderate, and to their own detriment, as well as to the annoyance of others. Personal appearance, we'll talk about that. Eating, exercise, how complex your cooking should be. Meditation, even. How clean to keep your home, and of course then politics. The argument for moderation on the conservative, on the left versus right continuum. Talk even about racism and sexism and environment and COVID bailouts, the three linchpins of the Biden presidency. I'm going to be making the case for moderation there. True inclusion, not cancel culture, not only tolerating, but if we talk about we need an inclusive society, we must recognize that all wisdom does not reside on the left nor the right, and demonizing them as extremists is ad hominem and not wise. I'm going to talk about moderation in making arguments, not nailing people to the cross necessarily. Moderation in spending, we'll talk about, and I'll give very specific examples about all these. Investing. Moderation there, and in terms of perfectionism, how perfect should we be, or slipshod, or is it done a case-by-case basis, which I will argue. All right, let us begin. So I want to start with with love. I have seen much unhappiness come from people bestowing too much love and too little love to their romantic partners, to their friends, to their family. There is, of course, there's value in showing love, but there's also a big downside. Too often, love is bestowed beyond a point where it's even wanted. Like this, I think about the smothering helicopter parent. I think about the smothering spouse who demands all this time with their partner, when in fact the other person has a right to be focusing more on whatever, more on work, more on individual solo activities. Couples should not be Siamese twins. Couples should be people who come together when it feels, in general, there's exceptions, but again, in moderation, generally when it's mutually comfortable. And I think that's crucial. Also, in terms of friends, where one person is always on the giving end of that friendship and the other on the taking. It's obvious and it's easier said than done. I will stipulate to that about all these things. But this notion of not let yourself get taken advantage of. On the other hand, you not taking advantage too much of the person, roughly, on average, not in every conversation, but the goal should be roughly 50-50, and the world doesn't end if it's 30-70, but it's a problem if it's 90-10. Okay. I do want to, before I go any further, I want to talk about the fact that moderation is not always the goal, at least as far as where I'm concerned. There certainly are examples where being driven to extremes is probably wise. For example, no great discoveries would occur, no iPhone, no medical discoveries, no COVID vaccines, if there wasn't extremism. People's lives who are at least temporarily out of balance, who believe that their work is more important than everything else. And so I'm certainly not going to plead that everybody should be moderate in their work life. It's going to depend, whether it be a for-profit thing or a non-profit thing. Sometimes it just feels like the life well led to be giving it all to whatever it is you care about. Even, extreme diligence regarding diet. My wife has managed she weighs still 114 pounds despite being older, because she's extremely diligent, and that is ensuring both that she looks great and her health. So, and she's rather extreme. She's not she doesn't weigh her food or anything, but she is almost always careful to eat the lowest calorie thing on the menu, to make low calorie dishes, to eat small portions, all that stuff. Lots of fruits and vegetables, the usual. But one wouldn't call her balanced on that. She doesn't, cheat every 4 meals with something fattening and yummy. She doesn't, or she might have one bite of cake and that's it. So I think that kind of extremism is not to be criticized. I admire it. I'm not so good myself, believe me. But now let's turn more to moderation examples. As I mentioned, one obvious example is in love, in the area of love. We've talked about, I'm not going to repeat it, but asking yourself whether you're giving too much or too little love to your romantic partner, to dating, which of course makes you feel desperate. If you're giving either too much or you're seeming cold and egotistical. The common word these days is narcissistic, if you're giving too little to your friends and romantic partners. But I want to talk about other examples of where, in general, moderation feels wise. There are some people, either because they just love being social or they use it as an escape from their own personal malaise, that are social all the time. They always have to be around people. And there are other people who are quite hermited. And again, while it's an individual choice, asking yourself whether you're as moderate as you want to be. Most people are wise to spend some time social and some time in significant solitude, both for individual activities, for reflection, and simply to unwind. Are you as moderate as you want to be regarding that? Amount of talking versus listening. I want the most of all. I've given a ton of how-to practical advice over the decades, and the most widely cited by individuals and republished is the traffic light rule, where keep your comments to. I'll just keep it simple. During the first 30 seconds of an utterance, your light is green. People are listening. You're not overwhelmed. In the next 30 seconds, your light's yellow. They're beginning to wait for you to shut up. And after the 60-second mark, unless you're telling a really interesting story, you should shut up or ask a question. You can always follow up later. So moderation in the amount of talking, and the converse is a moderate amount of listening. Listening your ass off, not 90% of the time, but roughly half, give or take, 30 to 70%, where you're in real good listening mode. And after they finish talking, you ask a question, or you summarize, or you, a question for amplification, or you disclose something, you build on their their conversation, or disagree politely. But that balance of talking versus listening, questioning versus disclosure, joking versus seriousness. We all like somebody who makes us laugh. But if it's too much, it's too much. We all kind of roll our eyes at the person who's trying too hard to be funny, or who, unfortunately, and I fail on this, I'm too often too serious. I try to remember to lighten up at times. And again, I'm not saying moderation is always the answer, but being conscious that Aristotelian golden mean, the moderation that Aristotle so preached and has survived over these millennia, there is wisdom in it. Not always. No wisdom is one size fits all, but there is wisdom in that. There can be a really good case for moderation and celebration. I must admit that I tend to just, like, for example, let my birthdays just go by. Our anniversary, we celebrated quite modestly. And maybe those are milestones worthy of celebration, although I'm more inclined to celebrate accomplishments than rather than something that can just occur by virtue of your being on the planet, that is, for example, a birthday. But my friend, and I won't mention his name, a very dear friend, he celebrates his birthdays big time, and the most memorable example is he invited everybody to come to Europe to a castle to celebrate his birthday. Now, I mean, it's probably fine, but it seems to me a little bit too self-adulating, and I would be more inclined to be more modern celebrations. Okay. Next, I guess it's not a bad time to say this. Okay, so you are listening to How to Do Life. If you're listening to this on a podcast, if you're watching on YouTube, you're watching on YouTube. And I am talking about the case for moderation and when moderation isn't such a necessarily good idea. When I come back from the break, it's only about 15 seconds, I'm going to talk about issues related to moderation in displaying your abilities, your personal appearance, eating, exercise, complexity of cooking, meditation, home cleanliness, politics, that is, conservative versus liberal, racism and sexism, the environment, COVID bailout, those linchpins of the Biden administration, true inclusion rather than cancel culture, making arguments so as to let people save face, moderation in spending, investing, and in how perfect to aim in doing your work. I'm going to argue for case-by-case basis. Anyway, plenty to talk about. Anyway, I'll be just 15 seconds. Stay with me. Okay, thanks for staying with me. Displaying your abilities. My mother always loved to show me and my sister off, whether it be our report cards or performing. I played the piano, she sang, and she would always push us, here, play for them, they want to hear you. And that has perhaps overly, I've incorporated that too much into myself, and I'm too much of a show-off. It's one of my weaknesses. So, but of course, if you completely hide yourself, you're subverting, sharing your gifts or whatever. You know, what they call Christian modesty, you should only go so far. A little bit of displaying your gifts without, you know, bragging about it or overdoing it might be another good example of where moderation is in order. Personal appearance. You know I deliberately most of the time just wear a t-shirt because I do want to be judged more on my substance than on my looks. And I love wearing a t-shirt. It's just who I am. I'm not a formal guy. My wife is a far more meticulous dresser. And everybody, she's known all around, you know, town as being always looking put together, even when she goes out to get the mail or the newspaper in the morning. But I want to invite you to ask yourself: are you spending too much time and money on your appearance, on your sizzle rather than your steak, on your gift wrapping rather than the product inside? I will merely ask you. You know, I know somebody who spends 2 hours or an hour and a half every morning getting ready to go out to leave. That's an awful large use of one's life, one's waking hours. So ask yourself, are you spending too much or too little? You know, some could say that I'm losing credibility by, you know, not being fancy and just throwing on a t-shirt. But make that choice personally. Eating. You know, we all know that the vast majority of dieters lose it and more. People do have a natural set point that is genetically determined, or at least certainly heavily influenced. You know, it's usually wise, except if you are obese, to accept your body style, your body type. I know that certainly, you know, this body image thing is especially for women, can be quite a cross to bear, and of course it's absurd to try to emulate the size 0 models. So ask yourself whether your eating needs to be moderate in quantity and from where I sit, in perfection. I happen to love pizza. I love chow fun. Unfortunately, I'm a carb fan. I try to avoid it most times, but I will occasionally have chow fun or pizza or something, or garlic bread, garlic cheese bread. Love all that stuff. And I don't think it's likely to kill me, and it also just feels like I'm not self-denying all the time. So ask yourself whether you're as moderate as you want. And I've kept my weight pretty much the same for all these decades. somewhere between, anyway, it doesn't matter, moderate. I'm a few pounds overweight, but nothing significant. And I'll live with it. I don't think that's going to kill me. Exercise, same thing there. Now this is, I'm not an MD and I don't have really good data, but I guess I do remember once reading that vigorous exercises do not live longer, triathlete types. And in fact, subjectively, as I look at long-term athletes who are very vigorous athletes, marathoners and people who run 7 miles a day or kill themselves at the gym, by the time they reach their 50s and 60s, their skin tone, it looks like they're, not skin tone, it almost likes their amount of wrinkles, the flexibility of their cells is decreased. Now, some of that could be because they're in the sun most, but I see those super vigorous exercises aging certainly at least as fast, if not faster, than people who are more moderate. I do exercise. I was a runner when I was in college, not a varsity runner, but I ran to stay in shape. But I've played basketball my whole life. But I like to think that now, I think it's wise that I hike vigorously every day. I'm out of my chair once an hour, and take at least a 5-minute walk, or do some exercise, whether it be mopping the floors or whatever, doing some gardening. I like to think that moderation is going to be wise, health-wise, and also it avoids your torturing yourself, with, for example, that high-intensity training. I know there's some data now that it's helpful, but we don't have enough years or decades of experience with its long-term effects, and it doesn't pass my common sense test that running your heart rate at 3 or 4 times normal for some short amount of time can long-term be healthy. Certainly when you're young, you can handle anything. But I'm not convinced that that's long. I choose to go the moderate route. Again, that's what this is about. I'm making the case in general for moderation. A complexity of cooking. I love to eat. I just do. I have one of these. I just love it. But you can often eat remarkably simply. And in fact, I'm going to make one of my next YouTube videos / How to Do Life podcasts is called 1 Minute Cuisine. There's an amazing amount of delicious and healthy and inexpensive food that you can create in 1 minute. And certainly on the, not saying you always have to do that, that would hardly be moderation, but realizing that. And I actually feel a little sorry for the people who spend hours shopping, chopping, cooking, cleaning elaborate meals. Is that really likely to be worth the effort? Is that the best use of your time? Now, of course, we all need some downtime to veg out, and sometimes cooking is that. But I would invite you in that spirit of moderation, which is the theme of today's show. Are you spending too much time on cooking? Again, just a question. I have a dear friend who meditates a lot. He goes even on 14-day retreats and is thinking about going on a 30-day retreat of meditation. And every day meditates at least an hour. Again, it strikes me that whatever benefits meditation brings, and I do think those are subject to, they may be more limited than the advocates who do most of the research would argue. Even if meditation is benefit, mindfulness and stress management or whatever, I like to think that moderation, again, is more wise, because that use of all that time, this guy who's my dear friend, is brilliant and has tremendous potential to make contribution to society. And yet he's spending a lot of his time, in what I would call a nap. He, of course, calls it meditation and gaining insight, etc. But I would invite you to ask yourself, if you are a meditator or contemplating it, whether you might be wise to do, a 5 or 10-minute meditation in the morning, if you want a 20-minute one in the evening, and let it go at that, and use your time better. Again, my plea for moderation. Home cleanliness. I also feel sorry for people who spend so much time making sure everything is picked up. Again, if you need that to kind of unwind or restore yourself, to have a mindless activity and move around, great. But there are people who are quite compulsive about keeping their house absolutely immaculate, and also torture their romantic partner about, leaving items in the sink or their underwear on the floor. In the larger scheme of things, those are just not that important. And moderation regarding cleanliness may indeed be wise. I wouldn't go as far as the religious statement, cleanliness is next to godliness. I think moderation is wise, and I invite you to consider that. Now I want to turn to politics. we are in an era of, whether you like the term cancel culture or not, we certainly do we value certain people value the term inclusion as though it's the holy grail, and yet we hardly are inclusive of people whose views are different from us. I really think that there is wisdom that resides both sides of center, even occasionally at the extremes, the extreme left and the extreme right. I'm not talking about Nazism extremism or killing people or white supremacism or full-on communism. I'm not talking about but certainly even fairly far from the middle. A very small government advocate. There is an argument for that. There is a strong argument for a more socialist, equal society. But what counts is really considering each argument on its merits, pros and cons, and that leads to a more moderate, true inclusive culture. And I think I've seen so much censorship and censorship of people who dare, forgive the expression, draw outside the lines of the mainstream. And that is, in my judgment, a formula for societal dissolution, both because of the increasing enmity between people who are on different sides of the political equation, but also because the best ideas are then getting truncated out. There are best solutions for societal problems, for not even just problems, moving society forward, are not just left of center or right of center. So I'm arguing that moderation in this case is for true inclusion. Okay, on a more micro level, sometimes when we make an argument, we're so hell-bent on winning that we really destroy the person unnecessarily. You don't need to nail him or her to the cross. Make your reasonable arguments and end with something face-saving like, well, what do you think? And then really listen your butt off. That's going to be a far wiser way to get people to change, for you not to be so cocksure yourself, because you may not be that right or even right at all. So make your arguments, leave some room for the other person, let him save face, and be open to your being wrong. Again, a moderation position. Regarding spending, certainly we need to, happiness increases when we spend on the basics. Decent food, which, by the way, doesn't need to cost a lot of money. Fruits and vegetables are cheap. And even in the so-called food deserts, unfortunately I see many people who are obese with large families walking right past the market, the bodega or the supermarket or whatever, to a McDonald's or whatever right next door and ordering fattening, unhealthy Happy Meals for their family. It's crazy. So I'm not saying you need to be perfect and be a vegan, eating only locally organic, sustainable stuff. But certainly, in terms of spending a lot, whether it be on food or spending a lot on a fancy zip code or a fancy car, a luxury car, which actually is more likely to break down, except for Lexuses, than a more reliable Toyota or Subaru, is kind of crazy. Or spending a lot on expensive jewelry or 5-star vacations, or fancy furniture. Your happiness is not going to increase, if at all, from more spending. In fact, it can feel like an albatross. It may most commonly make you feel like you've got to take this job that pays a lot so you can buy all this stuff, instead of something you'd find more rewarding. So again, yes, spending on the basics, to the extent you need to, healthcare, food, decent housing, decent, whatever. But this, the hyper-materialistic, I really look down, I will admit, at somebody who wears a Rolex watch. I know those things cost thousands of dollars and they don't tell any better time. They may tell worse time than a Casio for $10. So moderation in spending is often very key to a life well led. Same is true of universities. Spending on those two big expenses are housing, as I mentioned, and spending on higher ed. There is no evidence that the spending on a private college, for example, yields better long-term benefits than starting at a community college, especially, and then at a state university. Yes, private colleges get more rich people, and so there's better connections, but that's outweighed by many other factors, including the cost. So moderation in spending, even on higher ed, and certainly in housing, is wise. Investing. When some issuer, say, of a bond offers a high interest rate, It's not to be generous. It's because the risk is greater than of default. So whether I'm using bonds as just one example, but it's wise to at least be moderate. Bonds tend to be rated, different rating agencies, AAA, AA, single A, triple B, double B, B, and there's something worse than that. But aiming at least for moderate quality is going to get you the right balance between safety and risk. Investing in low quality bonds called junk bonds is usually quite risky and not wise. Same is true of stocks. Buying penny stocks and long-term flyers, offers the hope of some big return. But normally the wisest thing, and almost every good financial advisor will tell you this, even those who are advised to millionaires, is to simply invest in low-cost index funds. And I am not paid by Vanguard or anybody else. But Vanguard has traditionally and continues to be a low-cost provider of index funds, most of which do better than the market, in part mainly because their fees are so low. I have most of my money in something called Vanguard Growth Index Fund, and it has a fee of only 1/20th of 1% per year. That gives me maximum diversification across the S&P 500, overweighted by the companies that have done the best, which, objects in motion tend to stay in motion in the same direction, or as Warren Buffett said, never catch a falling knife. So I believe I'm well invested at almost no cost. And it's actually even not protected, but tax advantaged because they don't turn over very much. So moderation in investing is also in general very wise. If you're poor, you feel you got to go for a long shot, but you're more likely to lose money. Whether in the most extreme example, it's buying lottery tickets, but investing in risky stocks is much more likely to make you poorer than to compensate for whatever poverty you have. And finally, is how perfect should you be at work? Moderation is a little simplistic here. I'm a big fan of the gas pedal metaphor. It's every time you're facing a task, deciding whether you want to go pedal to the metal, that is really fast and get it done quick and dirty, or you want to really barely have your foot on the foot pedal and go slow and aim for perfection. That's going to vary with the task, and it's going to vary with your predisposition. I am not a perfectionist. I made some notes in preparation for this, but I certainly didn't script anything. I probably spent an hour and a half thinking about how to do this, what topics to cover. But I didn't go plan in advance exactly what I was going to say about any of these things. So I like to feel, I've done like about 800 YouTube videos now, and in the last year I've done over 40 of these How to Do Life podcasts, and over 1,900 articles and 13 books. And I like to think that my moderation in the level of perfectionism has resulted in my doing more net good than if I had been perfectionistic about any of this stuff. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I hope that there's at least something here where you'll decide you want to be more moderate. In any event, as I said, this is going to be the podcast. This will be converted into a podcast. It'll be, you can find it by just simply Googling How to Do Life Simplecast. It's also, it gets posted onto Spotify and iTunes. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I certainly appreciate your thumbs up and accept your thumbs down. I always look forward to your comments, and especially like it if you share on the social media, on your social media, so that my efforts can have broader impact. And I am flattered if you choose to subscribe to my channel. And in any event, I do thank you for watching. I am Marty Nemko.